Good morning.
Good morning. All right, we got to get the clock going here. And the only thing now, the whole interview is dependent upon me being able to read this very small writing. So, no, sorry. First of all, I want to just add one bit of a few things to Jen's resume. I was when she took the job of White House press secretary, it was remarkable to think backwards. When we met in 2004, she was a deputy press secretary in Iowa for John Kerry. 2007, became the traveling press secretary for Barack Obama for president. 2009, deputy White House press secretary. They stole her like 6 months into the administration to become the deputy White House communications director, the State Department spokesperson, the White House communications director. I forgot in the middle of all that, she was also the traveling press secretary for the president's re-election campaign. And then finally, the White House press secretary. So the amount of unique and interesting knowledge that I think Jen has to share, I think will be a real highlight of what we're going to do. And Jen, I want to take you back all the way to the very first briefing that you did. And I don't know how many people saw it, but when Jen walked out, you started with a statement, not a question, that basically paraphrased, when the president asked you to serve in this role, that you all had talked about bringing truth and transparency back to the briefing room. So one, talk to us about one you briefed on the very first day. I think I briefed on the second full day, which would have been the third day of the administration. And you started with a remarkable statement in order to do what in both the external, which I think we have some idea of, but also the room dynamics of inside of the briefing room.
Sure, and I'm just going to start by saying that Robert Gibbs is my favorite boss I've ever had, still to this day. So it's still funny to be sitting up here with him, and I have a lot of Gibbsisms, I don't even know how to call it, of things that he taught me and told me over the years that stuck with me. And I know we'll talk about preparation, maybe, but I will say before that first briefing, the reason that day was comfortable to me, I mean, I was nervous as hell, I'm just going to be honest, but was because I did probably 10 to 12 mock practice briefings. Robert was a key player in this. He was a complete jerk reporter. I'm not going to use a worse word, though it probably warrants a worse word. Anyway, so that was what happened before that, during the transition, when everything was happening with January 6th and everything was happening with COVID. We were practicing mock briefings, sometimes in my slippers. But I would say on that day, we made a decision during the transition that we were going to do a briefing on the first day that President Biden was sworn in. And that had never been done before. I don't know, but there may be some presidential historians in here who will tell me it has been done before. I don't know. I don't believe so. And we did that because we felt it was essential to send the message that we were turning the page from the way the last administration had approached press briefings and engaged with the media. And going into that briefing, I knew, and we talked about this, and I think I shared with you, because I wrote it in advance, what I wanted to say about how I was going to approach the job. That the most important thing I could do in that briefing was not necessarily not be tricked by all the questions they were asking, and that certainly is important. I was very stressed the night before that I was going to be asked like 20 questions on Venezuela. I mean, there's a lot going on there, but I don't know why that was in my mind. But was to convey to the press, and therefore the public, that we were going to reset the tone in the briefing room, and we were going to do everything we could when we were doing our jobs as best we could, and some days you don't, to provide accurate information, to be transparent, and for the briefing room to be a forum for news for the American people, information for the American people. And I knew that what I said at the top, and also what I said when somebody, which is kind of a White House tradition, that on the first day they always ask you if you promise not to lie, what I said in response to that was more important than anything else. So that was in my mind. Now, before I went out the first day, and there's actually this funny video of Karine, who's now the press secretary, and I kind of dancing and doing like a shimmy. You're just kind of trying to work out all the nerves or something before I went out to the briefing. But it was 7 p.m., and that was what the bar was, I think, for us, is trying to take the temperature down and the tone down, and over time take the venom out of the room.
Did you ever have a concern when you were talking to then President-elect Biden that you were signing up for a job that no longer really existed? And I think part of the preface of that question, and it builds off of this first question, I think the remarkable nature of that statement that you gave. I inherited the job from Dana Perino in January of 2009, you well remember. The world felt like it was falling apart, and I never felt like I needed to go into that room and start by resetting the tone, again, not just externally, but with inside the confines of those seats. Did you ever worry that this was a job that no longer really existed in the form that you remembered?
It definitely didn't. It still doesn't, for a range of reasons. And we've talked about this. I was there the end of the Obama administration as the communications director. I handed off to the Trump team and then kind of took the reins for, they handed off to us, I guess, in some capacity. That's a whole sidebar story. But if Hillary Clinton had won, which is what we all assumed, we would have recommended they not do the briefing every day, probably, or that they change how they do the briefing, because in a lot of ways, it's quite outdated. You only have a seat in the room if the White House Correspondents Association gives you a seat in the room, which means you have to show up a certain number of days. A lot of regional reporters, digital outlets, others don't have the capacity, the bandwidth to do that. There's still a lot of utility in it, and I know we've talked about this too, because one, it's what people don't see on the outside is it's incredibly efficient. There's no better way, I should say, to get people in the policy teams to finally make a decision about something than to tell them you're going to be asked about it in the briefing room, and they better get their act together and give you some points to use. And also, you get hundreds and hundreds of questions from around the world to the press office. And the press office, when I was working for you and when I was in the job, is only about a dozen people. It's not 100 people answering these questions. It's a very small team. So there's still utility in it, but it is outdated. I'll also say that when I spoke with President Biden, President-elect Biden, about the job in November of 2020, with Dr. Biden too, he said, I kind of prepared for this. I'm a bit of a prepper, which I think I'm exposing myself here for. I think I was like reading up on the South China Sea as if he was going to grill me on it. I don't even know. But most of our conversation was about his desire to take the temperature down in the room. And so, yes, that is not a conversation that most people who had been in that job before me had with the president-elect. But it was appropriate for the time that we were living in.
Yeah. Segue for a second to then President-elect Biden, to the soon-to-be First Lady. You obviously knew Joe Biden from your time in the Obama administration, but you probably didn't have what you would consider to be a sort of deep relationship. You weren't, part of, obviously the group around him has been around him for decades, not years. Mm-hmm. Walk through, for the group, how did you establish that relationship, and how important is establishing that relationship, given a lot of times you spend time with the president, you listen to him in meetings, you probably went in before the briefing to ask him some questions, but every day you probably are getting questions that you haven't talked to him about, but you're still having to impart his opinion. Mm-hmm.
That's very true. First, I will say, when the Biden team reached out to me about talking about this job, the first thing I said to them was, he doesn't really know me. How am I going to do this? How would I even really do this job? And they said, just talk to him, see how the conversation goes. And I kept with me, this is where I'm going to bring up a Gibbsian saying or piece of advice, something you had told me when I had worked for Barack Obama. When I started working for Barack Obama, I was 27 years old, And I am far from an ageist, but I will tell you I'm a lot more comfortable in my skin now at 43 than I was at 27. That's just the reality of most people's journey, certainly mine. And it took me years to be comfortable prepping Barack Obama and giving him good advice, candid advice, figuring out what was going to work with him. And it really took me realizing that not doing that meant I was not doing my job as a communications advisor. And most people don't hire, and there's some people in the room who live this, a communications advisor or a press secretary, a spokesperson, head of public affairs, because they want a yes woman or a yes man. See what I did there? Yes woman first, but there you go. But they don't want that. And it took a while for me to realize that. And it really took, in 2012, I was the traveling press secretary for Obama. And I realized at some point it hit me, there's not a more, David Plouffe was with us, but that, his job wasn't to be the press spokesperson. There wasn't a more senior person with me who was going to be advising President Obama. And I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do this, right? And Gibbs said to me, just act like you belong there. At a certain point, everybody will believe it. And that's pretty true, that stuck with me. And I was like, okay, I know how to brief him. I know how to prep him. I've now been working for him for 6 years. Anyway, long story short, this stuck with me when I went to work for President Biden too. I knew that we had to establish a relationship where he felt not only that he could tell me what was on his mind, but that he could tell me when he was pissed off, or he didn't like something I said, or he didn't like a story, and that we needed to develop that comfort level in order for me to effectively do my job. Now, to his credit, that was really easy with him. I think a couple weeks into the job, I was in the Oval Office with him. He liked to check in and ask, and this is pretty common, I think. I like so many presidents, but the two presidents I've worked for, they're very disconnected in many ways from the world because people are feeding them information, right? So President Biden used to say, what are people talking about? What are the press asking you about? So he'd check in with me. And there was one day a couple weeks into the job where I was in the Oval Office and I was sitting in a chair and we were chatting, and I said, this may be a weird thing to say to a president, which always when you start something like that, you're like, where is this going in my mind? I said, but I feel like I've known you a long time. And I hope you feel comfortable telling me I will know that I am in this job when you yell at me or you're mad at me for the first time. And
did he then start yelling at you?
Not in that moment, but not in that moment. But I do think that having worked for people like Barack Obama, learning lessons from you, John Kerry. Look, I think everybody in this room knows every principal is different, and you have to figure out the right way to engage with them in kind of an internal, how to talk to important people way, and they're all different. But that certainly helped me. You got to run out of the gate and say, you got to be comfortable with me. And I think that helped, even though I hadn't worked for him for years.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about how communicating, particularly at the White House, has changed. And I remember in 2010, I was calling a few press secretaries because, if you remember the election in 2010, we soon hit the iceberg. And
it wasn't good.
No, and
shellacking?
Shellacking, yeah. I spent a few days Googling what should we call this. I think he came up with shellacking, though. But I remember calling, I think it was Joe Lockhart, for some advice. And I think, Joe, the very first thing he said to me was, look, I'm happy to give you some advice, but I want you to understand, I worked in that building in a different century.
Yeah.
And it took me a second, I guess that's true. But I think it was much more sort of metaphorical than anything else. You were in the White House on day one of the Obama administration. You were in the White House the last day of the Obama administration, and then obviously the beginning of the Biden administration. How much has communicating from that podium, communicating in that building, structurally changed given all the inputs, given, as you said, a very different set of people that sit in those chairs every day, a very different news environment? I used to tell people, in 1980, in a much smaller country, 50 million people would turn on one of the three networks to get their news every night. It doesn't happen anymore.
I remember, and I don't know if you remember this, when we started in the Obama administration, the networks would say to us, well, we're next step in the rotation of interviews. And they said that because that had been the tradition for so long, right? You just rotated through the networks with interviews with the president. What changed dramatically, in I would argue a good way, is that there was all of a sudden this massive explosion of the type of outlets you could engage with and the type of platforms you could use to engage. That's overall a good thing. But I would say what changed for not, maybe in a bad way is the way that Twitter is a driver of the conversations that happen in the White House briefing room, and therefore what the White House speaks to in a daily basis. That did not exist in 2009. I mean, Twitter existed, but the way it drove things didn't exist. And when you look at the statistics of the fact that 80% of the country is not even on Twitter, it's very liberal, very white, very coastal. 10% or something of the tweet, or 90% of the tweets are done by 10% of the people. It kind of perpetuates this notion of people in Washington having a conversation just with themselves, basically, right? It's a story's on Twitter. Somebody tweets it. A reporter sees it. We know we're going to be asked about it or think we're going to be asked about it. You answer it. It's kind of this never-ending circle. And it means that I think you miss oftentimes a lot of stories that are happening out in the country, out in the world, because you're in this never-ending cycle of rhetoric and conversations that are happening on social media. And that, I think, is, it really does a disservice to the public when it comes to what that briefing and what the White House should be speaking to on a daily basis.
Yeah. I would often get asked at the beginning of the Trump administration, are we ever going to go back to normal? And so I'll sort of change that question a little bit, given sort of where we are with social media, given the sort of very fractured nature of the media ecosystem. Do you imagine that we're never going back to what we had? How's the next set of White House press secretaries going to navigate an even greater changing landscape of communications?
So I actually have an optimistic view of this, surprisingly, maybe. It's always changing, right? Everybody in this room knows media is always changing. The way you engage with media is always changing. If you looked at 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I mean, when Joe Lockhart was the press secretary, they waited for the nightly news and then they had a drink or whatever they did. I don't even know. That was it. Now it's 24 hours a day. I think what's kind of interesting about the moment we're in, and granted I'm currently working for a media organization, is that nobody really has the special sauce. Maybe someone in this room does, I don't know, but of how to completely break through to the public. It's really hard, right? If you look at what's happening with media organizations right now, it's like everybody knows the future is streaming, but how do you do that? People are experimenting, trying things out, right? I think as it relates to the people who have the press secretary job in the future, it's going to require a lot of experimentation and willingness to do that. And it's difficult right now in this Biden first term to do that because there still is a feeling of the nerves are afraid of the public. Trump's probably going to run, who knows, but everybody guesses will run for re-election. There's disinformation out there. It's hard to kind of massively change things up and not do the briefing every day or do it in an entirely different way. Or I wouldn't necessarily advise to do that right now. But if I'm being an optimist, I would hope that over time, there's an opportunity to really think about how you actually reach people and not what is dictated by traditions and the traditions of government communicating, because that is missing how you communicate with the public.
It is remarkable that, and I used to say this, and you've probably heard me say this, that a lot has changed in and around the White House, how the press gets a briefing, and the structure inside that room is very sort of 1970s, 1980s, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that you had to navigate more so than probably any White House press secretary is just the flood of disinformation. And I remember I was a bit naive about disinformation back in the 2008 campaign. We saw the beginnings of what I thought was just silly and crazy, this idea that nobody had seen Barack Obama's birth certificate. And
wild.
I know, and I remember I was on the road with him, and I called back and I said, I see this all in the clips. We've got like a copy of the birth certificate. Yeah. Can you just scan it and put it online? Figuring that like by week's end, this story would end. And it took years. There's still people that would bank on the fact that was born in Kenya. How did you navigate, and how do you think others can navigate in a world in which, quite frankly, I often think two people can go out on a sunny day and come to a different conclusion about what color the sky is?
Total. I mean, Peter Ducey, my friend and yours, and I would have these exchanges every day, and they would go up on social media, and the right on Twitter would celebrate Peter as this like beacon of truth, holding me accountable, and then the left would say she got him or Psaki bombed him or whatever, I know it's such a funny term. My sisters have sweatshirts just to make fun of me. People have siblings; they will understand that. But I think I feel like now I'm forgetting your question because I was on a Peter Ducey thing.
Yeah. Disinformation.
Oh, disinformation. Well, I will say this. A lot of what I learned about how to combat disinformation came from my time at the State Department, because when I was there in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine the first time. And it wasn't a topic that was dominating the news for months and months and months. I mean, Jay Carney was the press secretary in the White House, and he answered some questions on it, but it kind of dwindled over time. So the State Department, we were answering questions on this. It was 45 minutes of every briefing. And there at the State Department, you stay on one topic until the reporters are ready to move on to the next topic. So that's their tradition. But what I learned from that, one, the Russians, and RT, which is the Russian propaganda, now everybody knows what it is, Russian-run television, they were doing a television show about me every night. They made up things I never said. They had a whole gender-spurned campaign about me. They made up a term called Psakiing, when you're lying. Anyway, all of this was made up.
Rich from the Russians.
Rich from the Russians. But back then, it wasn't what people were really tracking here, right? So it was hard. But what I learned from it is when there's a propaganda bully out there, you got to punch them in the nose, I mean, you got to call them out. Otherwise, they're just going to keep doing their thing. So I think when I came into this job, and it took me a while to do that at State before I figured out the right way to do that. But when I came into this job, I knew that while we wanted to reset the tone, we also were not going to allow the room to be a forum for propaganda. And what happens in the White House briefing room, and has for many years, is some people who don't have seats in there and aren't even journalists, I know this is like wild to think about, they come in and they spout their thing, whatever their thing is. It could be people who are paid by foreign governments. There are certainly, at least for a Democratic administration, there are people who spout, yell at you about killing babies from like the side of the briefing room.
Lester.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of propagandists that come in there. And what I learned from my time at State is you just have to cut it off at the pass. I mean, you could not let them spout inaccurate information, or you have to fact check it in real time. Because otherwise, what happens is their information is seen on par, or their questions are seen on par as ABC and the Associated Press and the Washington Post. And sometimes that still happens in there. But on the days where we could cut it off, it required either kind of cutting them off at the pass and saying, "I'm sorry, we've got to move on." I mean, you're not actually punching them most of the time. No, just kidding. I never punched anyone. But or kind of when they say something, you're saying that's not true, and here is what is true. I don't think that's perfect, but I do think in that room, that's what I learned was one way to try to minimize it.
We've seen, I'm going to go to just a strategy question for the current White House. You're absolved from being... I was saying to Robert on the way in here that I was like, not late because I wasn't late for this, but I was a little late coming in because there was a motorcade and I was like, God damn these motorcades. It was like I've only been gone 5 months and I felt outraged by the delay in traffic. Exactly.
Yeah.
We've seen a lot more of Joe Biden on TV interviews, probably in the last, I bet, 6 weeks than in the first 16 months.
Yeah.
Do you think that's, I mean, obviously we're getting closer to an election. Do you think that is a strategy shift? Do you think we'll see more of those types of tactics if, say, for instance, Republicans control part of government?
I think you're going to have to. I mean, as you and I both know, the first year of a White House, there's interest in the first this, the first that, the first foreign trip. There's just greater appetite or ability to get easier earned media. It gets harder, always does. And in the age of Trump, it gets even harder. I think the thing about President Biden, from working for him for a year and a half, is he always thinks he needs more prep than he needs. I don't know if anybody works for anybody like this, where he needs like a day or hours and hours of prep. He does not need that prep. He's been working in government. He's been in the Senate forever. I mean, he doesn't need it. I actually think some of his best engagements with the press have been when you're on a foreign trip and you only have 15 minutes, and that's what you have. But I will say that can be, nothing is more valuable than the president's time. And when you need hours of prep, that can actually be the reason why you sometimes don't do an interview, because you have to govern and run the country and you don't have time for that. I do think that they've decided, clearly, watching from the outside and from talking to them a little bit, that there is value. And they've done many more interviews recently. In doing interviews and having conversations with reporters about what's happening in the country, what's happening in the world, where he is on issues. And I would expect they'll do more, and they'll have to do more because it will become harder and harder to break through as it becomes a presidential year, as who knows what shenanigans will happen in Congress if the Republicans win back the House, et cetera.
Right. All right, I've got a series of sort of quicker questions, and then we'll get some audience questions.
Oh, like a rapid fire.
Yeah, you don't have to be short. I'd never give short answers.
I know, I'm not a short answer.
Yeah, don't
I'll try.
Best day at the White House?
Ever? Last White House?
Biden White House.
Okay, the best day was the day that Ketanji Brown Jackson came to the South Lawn and gave her speech. And it was the best day for many reasons. One, her speech was, I mean, I'm gonna get choked up just talking about it, but it was, it's a grind working in the White House. It's a grind working many, many jobs. So it's a grind. You are exhausted. People are telling you how terrible you are every single day. It is, things don't feel like they're moving. And you have to really relish the moments that you realize you're sitting there for a front seat to history. And I remember sitting there, one, I was sitting next to Lisa Monaco, who's the Deputy Attorney General, who I know and have been friends with for many years. But I was laughing because, reporters were thinking, are they discussing cases? No, we're talking about where we're going to go on vacation. It's not that interesting. And I looked around. I, as she was talking, I couldn't control. I just was crying. It had been a dark winter, I think it's clear to say. The winter had come. And it was a beautiful day. I started crying as she was talking, and I was like, oh my God, pull yourself together. You can't be crying here. But then I looked around, everybody was crying around me. It was people from the counsel's office, people from the Department of Justice, people who'd worked on her confirmation. And those are moments that you have to cherish, and you realize you are a part of history. You are a part of something that you're gonna tell. My daughter's 7. I went home and told her about it. And you have to cherish those, because something brutal is going to happen in the coming days or hours. You never know.
Winter's always coming.
Winter's always coming.
Worst day at the White House?
Oh God, the worst day was the day that we lost 13 soldiers in Afghanistan, and I had, I think as a press person, you're kind of always thinking about what story you're engaging in and trying to move forward. And when I think about this, it's like my perspective on the day changes, because we had been trying to convince the press that there was a real threat of a terrorist attack or something, that there was a security threat, because we were being criticized for a number of things about the withdrawal, but one of them was we had to stay longer to get more people out. And so that morning, I walked into the Situation Room where there was a daily meeting on Afghanistan. The president was not there yet. You try to get there before the president if you're, And I said to John Feiner, who is the Deputy National Security Advisor, I think some people are going to start to write about the security threat. And he said, there was an attack. It's like it happened, right? And information's coming in, it's coming in, it's coming in. Now, when you're in these meetings, you're sitting in these meetings with the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who I don't know what he eats in every day, but he is this gentle giant of a man, but he is looks like he's ready to lead troops into battle. You're there with him, you're there with Chairman Milley, you're there with the Secretary of State, head of the CIA. I mean, these are the people running our national security in our country. Everybody has to hold it together. You know, it doesn't matter how long you're in government. Days like that are heartbreaking, they're horrible. And when the president came in, Chairman Milley, I believe, gave him an update on, at that point, it had been maybe 3 or 4 confirmed dead. It obviously increased as the day continued. And obviously my role in that is, you know, I'm not overseeing troops, thank God. I am not, but I needed to figure out how to handle the briefing that day, you know, and how to advise what the president was going to say. I will also add as a sidebar, I have a 4- and 7-year-old, and it was my daughter's kindergarten open house the same day as this happened. So I escaped for an hour in the middle of the day to go to her kindergarten open house, which is just like a working mom or dad thing that you have to do. But it was, it was, by the end of the day, you felt like there are days where you go out there to the briefing room, as you know, and you know that what you do is not going to change anything really. And all you can do is try to meet the moment with your demeanor and your acknowledgement of the tragedy that happened. But that was definitely the worst day.
You knew a lot going into the job. What surprised you the most while you were there?
Oh, wow. That's such a good question. I will say this is not what you're going to expect me to say. When you are, I was one of Robert's deputies. So when we started, you know, it's still like a good senior job in the White House. But when you're the press secretary or the communications director, like if there's a nuclear attack, like you might be saved. If you're not, you won't be. Like it's kind of like, I've seen how all sides live, and there is like a significant difference in kind of how things are handled when there is a threat or anything that might happen. You used to joke, I mean, this is your story, that David Axelrod, who is a beloved, wonderful friend of both of ours, he was also kind of a senior advisor. Tell me if I'm butchering this story.
No, you got it right.
And Robert used to joke that he was going to get a box of donuts and like throw some out for him so he ran faster the helicopter if there was an attack.
Yeah. You want to be on helicopter 1, not helicopter 3. And
So not a huge amount, but I would say, you know, the responsibility you feel, which I knew would be the case, of going. I will say the one thing that did surprise me beyond that, and this is the moment we're living in, is I had an enormous number of threats to my home, to my cell phone, letters, mail, my children's names, my home address. And that did surprise me. Maybe it shouldn't. I'm very tracking. It's a divided country, but I think that was scary and alarming because I have lived in this town for 20 years. I worked at CNN for 4 years where I sat on panels with lots of people who had worked for Trump, some of whom I have stayed in touch with. I know many of my Republicans. I don't think of people in that way, but it felt scary, and you don't know what is real and what is not real. So that was kind of a surprise. Not a good one, not a welcome surprise.
Yeah. What do you miss the most?
I miss the team, and I think I didn't really know many of the team members that I hired to work on the press team, and we had a couple of objectives. One was to hire people who had worked for the president on the campaign, myself outside of that, but and also we wanted to make sure that the team was diverse and represented the country. And I hired this amazing group of people who are now, some of them are still in the White House, but are now out doing amazing things. I mean, One of them, Vedant, is now the deputy spokesperson at the State Department. Michael Gwynn is now, I think he's like the spokesperson for international tax. Something that sounds really hard and scary. I don't even know. But you develop, you're in the foxhole with this group of people, and I saw, because I'd been out of government for a while, people would say, well, who would you recommend for somebody who's like 30 to do a job? And I would say, I felt a little bit out of I didn't know. And now I feel like I have this whole group of amazing people that I know are going to be running things in government or other places moving forward, and really getting to know them and playing a small role and kind of helping them develop further. I miss that part of the team, and we had a good time most days, almost every day.
What do you miss the least?
Oh God, probably waking up and looking at my phone and thinking what on earth may have happened overnight, because you just never know. You don't sleep well in that job, really, but that's probably the thing I miss.
They call you too and wake you up and tell you bad things have happened.
Yes, I know. Not always. It's usually not welcome calls.
There's somebody in the world right now that a lot of people probably in the world, a lot of people in this country that are looking at you and thinking to themselves, how do I get to be Jen Psaki someday? What's the best piece of advice that you would give a young communications professional about being successful in the business of communications?
Well, I'm very flattered by that, and I still feel like I'm 22, even though I'm not. So I guess I'm tracking that. I would say I have a couple. One is, it is not more complicated than absolutely crushing the job you are currently in. You do not, I have never had a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. I don't know what I want to do when I grow up. I actually think that sometimes that's limiting. It is about being in the job you're in and absolutely doing it 150% and doing it with a good attitude and asking to do more. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. Second, I would say, and I was an English major in college, so I'm a little biased on this front, but I think the ability to write coherently and clearly is undervalued. And I know probably a lot of people in this room have hired a lot of people. And every time I talk to people who are in college, I tell them that. Yes, you can be a journalism major, you can be a major in all sorts of things, but the ability to write and cohesively do that and capture your thoughts is important. The third thing I would say is not to be immune to new information. Things are constantly changing in the country, and you can't be so set in what you think and believe that you're unwilling to digest and receive additional information. And the ability to talk to people you disagree with, to read broadly, which I would also advise, will make you a better communicator. So I don't know, those are my 3 pieces.
That's great.
What's your piece of advice before we go to questions? Or 3?
Wait a minute, I'm asking the questions.
I know, but I have more questions for you.
Well, I'll think of some advice. I want to ask you one thing. We've got somewhere there's microphones. I can't see a thing. So if you want to raise your hands, we'll go to microphones in a second. I want to ask you though, before we transition to audience questions, you're about to trade seats and be on the other side of the press communicators divide.
Yeah.
As people get ready with their questions, walk us through what you're going to do and how you're feeling about having been on one side for so long and now going. It's not like this isn't like a Star Wars dark side thing, but like, how do you talk about the fact that it's a different position, a different perspective. In a world that you have now watched as a communicator for 20 years, what do you most hope to bring to the discussion or to media as part of the new endeavor? Sure.
So I have just embarked on this new venture, but I would say the thing that so this is a piece that I hope my new venture will have in common with my old venture, which is the thing I loved. There's a lot of things I loved about being the White House press secretary, but one of them was that you could it necessitated you really diving very deeply into policy hard, gnarly issues to really understand them so that you could explain them and talk about them publicly. It's really not about reading pithy talking points. Most talking points that are written are terrible, I will tell you. It's about being able to explain things in a way that you have that flexibility on your feet. I mean, we used to joke that when the oil spill happened, that Gibbs became like this oil baron expert. It was kind of like, well, he had like charts in his office, but it necessitates you doing that. And I'm a believer that people in the country do want information and do want accurate information and do want to know more about substantive things. I also think they hate the back and forth rhetoric that often you see from people in Washington. I mean, I joke sometimes, and it's true, and I've lived here for 20 years, that you could be at a bar in Washington and overhear people saying things like this. I'm grateful for your boss, the general lady from Arizona, who helped us with the squad. I know she's a member of the Blue Dogs, but it's good that we got it across the finish line. Like, I actually know what they're saying, but I'm like, what on earth does that mean, right? And so my hope is that I can capture, or on the best days, talk about, explain, unearth, unpack, call BS sometimes on complicated things and do it in a way that is accessible. And I also hope that I can do some of that. I mean, I've spent most of my career on campaigns and in the country. And I was telling Robert that I just was in Pittsburgh last week, traveling around or following some canvassers, door knockers. Stay tuned on MSNBC Thursday and Friday. We'll see more. But and it was such a reminder to me of what I loved about politics and what I loved about campaigns, which is actually seeing how people talk about issues, you know? And people there, they were for Planned Parenthood, so they were talking about abortion rights. They were not talking about, well, I hope my candidate is going to codify Roe. I mean, like, nobody knows what that is, most of the country, right? They're talking about their rights and how they think their friends should have rights, and they think it's ridiculous. So that, I think, is what I hope to capture. We'll see, but stay tuned.
Excellent. Again, I can see very little, but somebody must have a question. Go ahead.
Hi there. Jim David with ProSec Partners here in Washington. Thank you for the great conversation. You made a point about Twitter driving the conversation and all the ways in which that's problematic. Curious, did you do specific things to try to overcome that and to try to reach deeper into the national dialogue? Welcome your reflections on that.
That's such a good question. I would say probably not enough, and some of it is you run out of bandwidth and time to do exactly that, but that's the kind of thing as future press secretaries experiment they need to do. I mean, we did, you know, I think there's a lot of things that are problematic with social media platforms. I've been quite vocal about that, but I also don't believe we shouldn't use them. I think it's how the majority of the country is receiving information. There were things that we tried and we experimented a lot. I used to answer questions from people. I would sometimes do videos just explaining an issue, and they would get a surprising number of views, right? And we also, the digital team at the White House has to be very creative because you literally have no budget. I mean, you go into the White House and they're like, here's a pencil, good luck, you know, go tell the world what's happening. You don't have any money to buy ads or do paid media. That's just not what's in a government budget. From the White House, it is sometimes from the agencies. So you have to be quite creative. They have tried a lot of different things. I mean, we did a briefing with TikTok, Ukraine, people who are on TikTok talking about Ukraine. We tried a lot of things, right? But I think that's one of the reasons why this moment is so interesting, right? Who knows if it's going to be the same platforms around in a couple of years? Obviously, we know things still change. But I think that spending the time experimenting and trying different things and not being so fragile about how you use the president's time, how you use the time of prominent people in government is kind of an essential part of their success moving forward. I'm sure they'd welcome ideas if anyone has them in this room.
Who else? Don't be shy.
Over here.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Simone Shenny. I'm here as a Georgetown PR and Corporate Communications Master's student, and I also work in PR in public policy. And my question is right now with the polarization in the country and disinformation and the lack of trust, how communicators can better reach people who may not agree with them or may not see eye to eye to them, but really make an impact on a different group of people.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm a believer that you can't only think about audience as the only question you're asking yourself or the tactics of reaching the audience, because the most important thing is what are you saying? Like, what's your message? What are you trying to convey? But I do think that there's not enough thinking about how you reach different audiences. I did Fox News and Fox News Sunday more than any other Sunday show because I felt like I knew that some people might be hate watching. Fine, I don't care. But also, you have to be honest with yourself about the size of an audience like that. I'm talking as a Democrat, right? The size of that audience, the fact that there are many Democrats and independents watching Fox, and not to be, again, so fragile about what outlets you're willing to engage or not engage in. I know there are arguments of like, you should ban Fox or not appear on Fox. Like, Fox is not appearing because a handful of not disappearing because a handful of Democrats don't appear on their outlet. But I do think that being creative beyond the traditional outlets of just the networks or just major daily newspapers is also vital, because you can find, by really looking at the data of the reach of different outlets, digital outlets and others, that some of these reach far larger audience. I remember when I left the Obama administration, I had this argument on stage somewhere with somebody from the Washington Post about how Obama hadn't done an interview with the Washington Post and he'd done interviews with kind of YouTube personalities and other people. It's like, well, they have a bigger reach, right? They're reaching more of the public. And I am a reader of the Washington Post, but you can't be so fragile about where you engage or where your boss engages if you're trying to reach the American people.
Yeah. Who else?
Hi there. My name is Mubashra. I'm a senior consultant at Fleischman Hillard. I'm also one of the inaugural Young Changemakers here, recognized by Provoke and We Communications.
Amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you. So my question for you, as a young communicator and storyteller, based on your incredible career, I'd love to know what you found to be some of the strongest strategies to change perspectives. And, again, going back to that last question, especially with people who have different perspectives that you may not always agree with.
Yeah. I think two of the undervalued approaches are listening to what people are saying and talking about. And I mentioned being in Pittsburgh and talking to people and watching as people were having conversations about a combination of abortion rights and the economy, right? They weren't talking about it the way people talk about it when you get talking points sent to you from groups based, very good advocacy groups, but based in capitals around the country. But listening, I think, is key. I think that one of the other thing I would say is writing, right? If you can, to me, I find writing out arguments to be very helpful, and then reading it after that. I know that sounds very basic, but sometimes it can clarify your thoughts and help you realize if this is something you can explain for me to my mother-in-law, right? Or my friends who are not involved in politics or not. The third thing I would say is always have the receipts. And what I mean by that is facts are very important, but they're very useful when you're making an argument at the right time, right? And especially if you're countering something that you know is not truthful, it's not just about the words you use, it's about what you have in your back pocket that makes people think about things in a way that they didn't. And the last thing I would just say is remember that the goal of communicating, I think, is not to have the last word, right? Or to yell over somebody. It's to make somebody think that they maybe want to listen to you more and be open to your argument, right? Whether it is buying something or voting for someone, that's what it's really about. And so And sometimes if you watch cable or Twitter, it's easy to forget that a lot of that stuff is not always with the goal in mind of how you're going to win or get people to buy your candidate, your product, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I want to add one thing to that. You're remarkably young. Understand that changing perception takes time.
Yeah.
It isn't going to happen quickly or overnight. But I'll give you two examples. We both worked in the 2004 presidential campaign, part of which was predicated on how states were going to ban gay marriage. 11 years later, the Supreme Court makes gay marriage the law of the land. 11 years. Now, if you're fighting that every day, 11 years feels like a long time. 11 years in the scope of history, and you think about that last panel, is a blip. I saw a poll yesterday, 68%, so let's just round to 70. 70% of the American people are for the legalization of marijuana. That number has probably more than doubled in the last 15 years. Perception can be changed, it just takes time, and it takes good factual arguments, and it takes perseverance. If you think you're going to change everybody's perception and you give yourself 6 months to do it, don't be discouraged that when you get there to 6 months and 1 day that you haven't made a big change.
That's the best
But
advice.
stay with it. I think we've got one. Who's got a microphone there in the back?
Is it on?
They pause the clock at 3 seconds.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, so I'm Kendra Llewellyn. I am digital marketing manager at Profit, but I have a background in communications. And I just had a question about, where's the fine line between striking a balance between, combating and addressing disinformation versus legitimizing disinformation?
Whew. We could have like an hour conversation about this topic. I am a believer that most of the time, we as communicators, ignoring it doesn't make it go away. And that is because of the way and the speed through which information travels. And Gibbs and I have talked about this over the years, and he may have a different view. If you go back again to the Kerry campaign, one of the well-documented things that happened on that campaign was the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth questioned John Kerry's military record. That was obviously completely fabricated and false, but they did it with a book, with paid media, with a very effective effort. There wasn't the same response at the same speed. Because at the time, and I was like a baby on this campaign, and Gibbs was not on the campaign anymore. He had met this guy, Barack Obama, I think, by that point. But that I think is often, that case study is an example of how you can't information is still going to travel even if you ignore it. So I am a believer most of the time that when there is disinformation, you need to do everything you can to combat it, nip it in the bud. The best response is accurate information. There are, though, times, and you didn't ask about this exactly, where I think you can make a mistake by acknowledging people who are just trying to be, outlandish, right? So Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, we didn't talk about her for the first year of the Biden White House purposefully, because we didn't want to have a fight with Marjorie Taylor Greene. I don't even remember what craziness she said every day. It was something crazy different every day. I don't know that that was necessarily right, but we just decided strategically if we did that, the headlines would be White House fights with Marjorie Taylor Greene. We didn't want that. But I don't know. What do you think?
No, I'm totally in agreement with this, and I think the example that you use on swift boating, you're probably too young for this, but disinformation would never start like it did in 2004 with a book and a press conference. Why would you? There's entire platforms that are unregulated and unmetered in which you can start to have this conversation. And I think of it as, and trust me, I've sat in meetings both in government and in the corporate world. Let's not say anything because all we're going to do is give rise to this thing that's over here. And then I usually try to remind people that thing that's going on over here, it's going on.
Yeah.
The question is, over here, are we going to participate in trying to change any hearts and minds as this thing happens. It's not as easy maybe or as linear as that, but I think unless you meet, if disinformation doesn't at least meet the effort towards better information, then disinformation is going to win every single time. And slowly but surely, you have to whittle that away. Paul, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Jen.